Okay, welcome back for our economic update with Brad Olsen. So I'm just going to hand it straight over you, Brad. Questions at the end?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Kia ora, and what are we? No, yeah, we're still good morning. Sorry, time is a bit of a moving feast at the moment as an economist. I feel like I've had probably more sleep in the last couple of years than I have the last couple of days with the likes of budget and similar going on. But it's fantastic to be back with you to provide a bit of a overview of what we're seeing out there in the economy against the backdrop of course, more challenging global economic times, the likes of the budget in recent days and everything else besides. I've also got Matthew Ullman with me, one of our economists at Infometrics, who is with me in budget lockup, who I might call on if I need to, if there's any... we'll leave him there only because otherwise I feel like he'll get too worried that I'm about to sort of give him a hospital pass on budget. I'm sort of prone to do that, certainly on budget day. Anyway, let's get into things. Questions would be great at the end if that's all right, just because, as normal, there is a bit of a method to the madness. Long story short, as you can see from the title of the presentation, we were expecting a much stronger level of economic recovery this year. Things were looking up. We were publishing better and better numbers, and then things have come not quite to a grinding halt, but we really have seen that sort of progress has been a bit undermined by the global economic challenges that have been coming through. You saw that even yesterday with the Reserve Bank coming out with a decision to cut the official cash rate, true, but for only the second time in their history, they took a vote. One of their members voting to not change the official cash rate because of just that level of uncertainty in the economy and the risk that although the economy itself is not doing well, there's still a lot of pricing pressure in the system. That's what the Reserve Bank cares about first and foremost, is inflation. And so with that sort of two-speed part of the economy, there is a bit of worry about where we go in the future. We've banned the word unprecedented at Infometrics back in 2020 when COVID was coming through because we were just overusing it a bit too much. We've now sort of unbanned it a bit in 2025 given the tariffs that have emerged. As you can see on the chart, average tariff rates from the US are now effectively going back to the highest levels that they've been since at least before World War I. This is really quite unusual stuff. Now, the difficulty is it's not quite clear at any given day or hour what exactly which tariffs are on, off, paused, or otherwise. This is sort of representing a bit of an average view across everything that's announced and then unannounced. But long story short, I think the implication is sort of the same. Whether or not they're formally on or not, if you're a business, if you're a household, are you really going to plan around the fact that things can change on one tweet? And so that sort of risk of the uncertainty, it's not so much that the economy looks bad or good or anything else, is that no one quite knows. The sort of fog of whatever's next is really clouding that view. What it is meaning is that most people's expectations for the US economy, and of course that is a key driver of what happens globally, have changed around quite a bit. You can see these are sort of how forecasts for US inflation and GDP have changed over time. If we look at the likes of inflation, had been seeing a more stable expectation for inflation up until around November last year, then just a few creeping down starting to come through, really hit the pace a bit more at the start of this year with the tariffs being announced and expectations that people will have to pay quite a bit more. Tariffs are, of course, just a straight-out import tax. Someone's got to pay them, and that's normally the consumer at the end of the day. At the same time, expectations for US economic growth, the GDP line, again starting to show a bit of improvement. Second half of last year was pretty solid and then dropped out pretty quickly once the tariffs were announced. If you're paying a whole lot more for stuff, if people are not going to be trading quite as much, if your companies are not going to be investing quite as much, that economic activity expectation falls quite quickly. So it's a tough backdrop because we know that for New Zealand, it's not the direct hit from the tariffs that are going to hurt us, it's the broader challenge. If the likes of the US isn't going to be doing quite as much trading activity with China, who's our biggest trading partner, at some point, a Chinese factory that had 400 workers is going to get cut back to 350. That's now 50 fewer workers that have got money to buy New Zealand kiwi fruit or milk products or whatever else it might be, and so on and so forth. So we are a bit worried about that sort of wider contagion effect. In terms of direct hit, again, not coming through quite as much locally directly, but it does still have, I guess, an interesting way to think about it in terms of some of our bigger exports. The likes of wine exports is New Zealand's most exposed to the US market, around $700 million or so, at about 34-ish% of our wine exports last year going to the States. The difficulty there is that if I'm a US wine consumer, I can choose to find something else. I can buy a cheaper Californian wine. Very easy to switch, and so if I'm a New Zealand winemaker, I'd lose some market share. That's why some of the US exporters have already in the wine space started to cut back their prices a bit to try and maintain the same volume, bottles, numbers, and similar going into the States. A few bits of machinery in there as well, depends on how specialised it is as to how much the US might change it around, but the sort of other end of the spectrum is meat. 2.6 odd billion of New Zealand meat being exported into the States last year, just over 30% of our total meat exports. The difference there is that the US doesn't have another alternative they can turn to. The US meat market is currently at its lowest in 70 years. They can't just magic up more cows. If they want to continue to have McDonald's hamburgers and mix New Zealand lean beef into it, they are going to have to pay for it. So that's again where we're not seeing a huge shift in how our meat exports are going, but again they will effectively become more expensive. Now overall, that means that if you're talking for the world's biggest and most well-spending economy, that's 10% minimum now that they have to now spend on tariffs on imported goods. That's 10% less they can spend on other stuff in the broad. So it is a tougher environment, and again that uncertainty just hits. Where's the New Zealand economy sitting at the moment? We have been seeing sort of a real sort of shift in trends over time. As you can see on this chart, overall spending activity had been lifting quite strongly over a sustained period before the pandemic. A few dips and troughs as we move through lockdowns and similar, but apart from that, pretty healthy growth up to some very, very high levels through sort of 2023. After sort of mid-23, as interest rates started to be increased and similar, as inflation was getting high, households were under pressure, spending levels generally came back. From mid-last year, things picked up a touch. And you can see here, see that coming through from about July 2024. Lower inflation starting to come through with lower interest rates, some very small but still enough overall to change things, tax cuts from the government, all added to a bit more momentum. But you can see that over the last sort of couple of months, it's higher than it was a year ago in spending levels nationally, but it's pretty limited still overall. What is interesting, you'll see a little bit of a pitch up right at the end of last year. That was a very good Boxing Day sale for a lot of people. We saw a 13% increase in Boxing Day spending compared to last Boxing Day, largest gain in a decade. Although when we looked at the rest of the month, what became clear was that it wasn't that people had a lot of money to spend, it's that when they were going to spend, they wanted to get really good discounts. So they didn't spend as much the couple of weeks leading up to Christmas because retailers don't put on specials. They know that schmucks like me need to go and buy mum a Christmas present, and so they know that they can get any money out of me those couple of weeks before Christmas. But come Boxing Day, big sales on, a lot of volume to be moved, and that sort of came through. So it does suggest that there is money in the system, but it also says that people are still acting quite cautiously. You can see that with this chart as well, showing consumer confidence. Anything above zero is more optimist than pessimist, and below the opposite. You can see that business confidence rose quite quickly. That's, of course, partly driven as well by a change in government, so take that with a bit of a grain of salt. But it's the consumer figure that's much more interesting in the fact that it took quite a while. It's only been the last month or so that you've had more people be a bit more optimistic. And that's not saying that they are wildly optimistic, it's just that I think everyone's going, well, next year seems to generally look better than this year. It's not going to be awesome, but at least interest rates are coming down. So just a real slow grind in terms of moving people through there. We know that some other parts of the economy, there's a bit more of a few different speeds coming through. The likes of international tourism getting a little bit more momentum coming forward, but again, very, very different markets. This is a bit of a proxy for how the global economy is going as well. US arrivals into New Zealand already above 100%. Great, they've got money to spend, that's good. I did just also profile, though, that they're paying a bit more in import taxes, so question mark over how well that's sustained. But New Zealand's other big market, China, only got to 61% recovery before it started to dip away. Borders have been open for 2 years. If it was going to recover, it would have by now. And so the fact that it hasn't, again, just suggests that some of those parts that were driving the New Zealand economy generally before the pandemic, not coming back to quite the same degree. Domestic travel, which I haven't got on the chart because I haven't got great numbers on it, but we can sort of see it in some of the spending figures where, again, households in New Zealand just haven't got quite as much cash as they did before. Tourism's the first thing they cut back. They're not going to go as far afield. They're going to sort of, stay local and do cheaper, if not zero-cost things with their family. So, again, that domestic travel pulling back too. The areas that are more upbeat is the likes of the primary sector. Saw announcements this morning that Fonterra have confirmed an expectation for 2 years in a row of a $10 milk payout, highest ever on a nominal basis. Some real good cash spend coming through. And you can see that coming forward across a number of New Zealand's key exports, meat, dairy and horticulture, all in a better area. So all of those continuing to contribute, and in particular that dairy increase this year is an extra $4.5 billion in cash spend available to the economy. Now, of course, when I look out the window, there's not too many cows around, so that doesn't come through as immediately to all parts of the country. We are seeing a lot more spending activity and just general momentum showing through a bit more in rural and provincial economies. That will eventually come through to the urban centres. I know it's a bit hard to see, but it does always flow through. But there is a good sort of 6 to 12 month lag. Takes a bit of time for farmers generally to pay off a bit of debt to start with. They do a bit of deferred maintenance, which is often for spending in their local area. Then they go out for broader services that eventually come through from cities. They need a bit more professional service work. They might need some construction and that sort of thing, where often manufacturing and what have you from the city starts to provide a bit more. Forestry, though, still in a pretty difficult position on an inflation-adjusted basis. As you can see here, still some of the lowest returns we've seen in a while. So not quite as worthwhile. Locally, and probably a bit more importantly, nationally, but relates through to some of the local trends. You can see here a lift finally in manufacturing intentions and activity in the orange line. Again, sort of similar to before, anywhere below the blue line, anywhere below 50, contraction, anywhere above expansion. You can see that services in the economy sort of haven't been doing quite as well. They've lifted towards sort of a bit more break even, but they haven't really started to expand. Manufacturing has for the last 4 months or so. The difficulty is that that's 4 months of positive after 24 months of negative, which means it's still negative 20 on a net basis. Things have continued to come down, lower and lower orders, and then they've started to pitch up just a bit. That's, I think, indicative that businesses do think and are starting to get ready for a bit more of an uptick in activity. No one wants to be sitting there with their business without stock or similar when the spending starts to come back. So there's a little bit of, hey, let's get some early orders in to make sure we've got enough stuff ready to go. But it's not like rip-roaring like it could be. So again, momentum coming back, recovery starting to come through, just kneecapped out a little bit more than it would otherwise be because those investment intentions and similar not coming forward. Inflation in our mind, certainly in my mind, is still a concern, and I think that's why you saw quite a different view come out from the Reserve Bank yesterday from what a lot of market commentators were talking about. People in the market seem to be going, look, we should be slashing interest rates, the economy's in a bad state, we need some more support coming through. The Reserve Bank does not care about economic activity like that. They do not care if GDP is weak. They care about it to the extent it has an influence on prices. Their main only focus is on price stability. At the moment, you have seen the interest rates cut back quite a bit as well. And so the Reserve Bank's view, and it's the same as most forecasters, is that not all of that has been fully felt in the economy yet. People have not fully refixed their interest rates, even though we've had more than 2 percentage points shaved off the OCR. You can see as well sort of an expectation that, yep, there's some further cuts to go, but not quite as much into the future. And probably most importantly on this chart is if you look at where the official cash rate is expected to end up, somewhere around 3%, and you track back to where it was in 2019 at below 2%, we are not getting back to the old normal level at all. We are not trying to stimulate the economy, we're just trying to stop restraining it. So we're not putting the foot on the accelerator, we're just slowly taking off the brake and trying to find that sort of new normal Goldilocks zone in the economy. And that's because, yes, we've got inflation down at a headline level towards more regular levels. You can see the red box here, the Reserve Bank wants to try and get inflation back to somewhere between that 1 and 3% mark. It got down to about 2.2. Lifted ever so slightly to 2.5 in the most recent figures, and you can see that was driven by the likes of overseas-based inflation starting to re-accelerate just a touch, a little bit more on the goods side as well as some of those physical items start to increase a bit more. Now, looking at that chart, you probably look at it and go, you know what, things aren't still too bad considering recent history. True. However, if your perspective is Mount Everest, then everything is always going to look a whole lot smaller. If we zoom into what you might sort of think about a bit more normal, you'll find some of the highest inflation activity outside of abnormal times that we've seen in quite a while. At any other point in the inflation cycle, if we hadn't have seen the likes of the 7% in that a couple of years back, 2.5% would be the place where the Reserve Bank would start to hike interest rates, not continue to cut them. Now, I still think that they can cut them down to 3% because, again, it takes a bit of time for all this stuff to move through the middle. But for the Reserve Bank at the moment, there's just enough pressure in there that they'll be starting to feel a bit queasy that inflation's already getting towards the top of the band, even while the economy's weak. And so there is this real feeling of, okay, if the economy does start to recover a bit more, what's to stop those price increases going from already uncomfortable to even more so? And that's sort of how we got ourselves into the position last time. We said, oh no, there's a good reason for inflation to not continue to go up. There's all these reasons, even though it was actually in reality still rising. So I think there's a real cautious note to have there. You'll see that as well because inflation expectations across businesses, but on this chart as well across households, have pitched up. They've continued to fall over time. If you ask people what they think inflation will be in the future, it's generally been not quite as much. Last couple of months, it's been a bit more. And I think that's because you're seeing, particularly for households, some of those more core costs rising. You look at the likes of food prices, butter's up, oil's up, olive oil that is. The likes of your coffee, your cocoa, everything else is continuing to increase. Electricity prices are continuing to rise as well. So a number of those real core costs that you sort of feel and you see and you pay regularly are continuing to increase and just making us a little bit more nervous. Interestingly as well, that started to see a shift in how households have been responding. You'll see on this chart sort of how long people are locking in their mortgage for in terms of new lending. And up until sort of February, there was a real big focus on fixing for either 6 months or sometimes just floating for an extended period. Everyone knew that if they just waited a bit longer, interest rates would come down, they'd get a better rate. Come through to March, everyone's like, ooh, things start to feel a bit more uncomfortable. There's some not too bad deals on offer at sort of the 1 to 2 year rate. Maybe interest rates come a bit lower, but maybe they don't either. And so as a household, more people are going, you know what, I quite like the stability of 2 years. I know exactly what I have to pay for the next 24 months. And although I could get better, I could also risk it all on the house. And so I'd take a bit of stability at the moment. So that sort of risk return is starting to emerge a bit more. Let's talk local trends and how all of that's playing through in the local economy. Worthwhile, again, always reprofiling the structure piece because that does start to have an influence on why you see some of the numbers in the Porirua economy changing around in a different way compared to the national trends. You can see there construction's still the biggest employer, roughly 16% compared to just over 10% for the national average. The city is a lot more exposed to how construction trends flow out, and that becomes important as we go forward. Further or larger focus on the likes of health and education as well, plus a bit more on the retail and professional services side. Interesting profile in that professional, scientific and technical services there sitting in 5th spot. It has really closed the gap with the national average over time. There is increasingly a focus on Porirua sort of going up the skills ladder a bit more and seeing more of those professional services roles as businesses expanded and as the district. It's because I sit in the Porirua District Court as a JP, and it means that I've got PDC and PCC in my head all the time. I promise I'm not trying to diminish things here. But again, gap closed a bit more over time because people are sort of looking and living around and operating and working around the city a lot more. In more recent times, things have got a whole lot tougher. You can see on this chart a 2.5% fall in filled jobs for Porirua City over the last year or so. It's still, in a sense, it could have been a lot worse given some of the other challenges out there, but it really does just show that the wider challenges coming through from not only government cutbacks, and that is part of it, but certainly not the whole thing. It's also the fallback in construction otherwise that's sort of taken things out. It's just very hard to convince people that they need as many workers at the moment because there is not as much work to go around. And in general, we see this at an industry level, but I think you're starting to see it in a number of other areas too, where businesses are having to go, look, previously we had this many workers for this much work, now I've got this many workers for that much work. It doesn't necessarily compute. I just can't continue to carry that level of people relative to the work I've got, and so there is quite a lot of rationalisation of workforce starting to come through to meet the level of actual demand. That's not just a you guys story. I don't want to sort of feel like you're singled out and that things are exclusively doom and gloom in Porirua compared to the rest. You can see on this map, heat map, put it this way, even with the areas that are hot are still sort of like the least decliners rather than actual outright growers. But you can see jobs activity here are a lot stronger generally across the South Island. Greater focus on the likes of international tourism, greater focus on the likes of that primary sector return compared to the North Island, where you've got a range of things going on. You've got more of a domestic travel market that isn't going as well. Yes, you've got the primary sector in some areas too, but you had a much drier stance of it in the North Island this year, and so there have been a lot of higher costs that have come through, so not as much gain. And then you've got the likes of the public service cutbacks, and wider than that, just professional services, which are more based in the North Island, again pulling back just because there's not as much business activity over time. So not trying to single you out and sort of just highlighting that there is more of a general trend coming through. This is where you start to see the real impact. If we look at jobs in Porirua compared to a year ago by industry, you start to see things becoming a lot clearer as to why those numbers are in such a more challenging spot. Health is still up by just over 100 roles. That's true of just about anywhere we go across the country, has a lot more health employment. Great, we know we need it. We also need to be able to resource them properly and similar, but that's sort of good that there's a better starting number. Bit more in the arts and recreation space. Again, I think you're just seeing a little bit more below the surface, where there's a few more events and activities and similar coming through. Although the likes of accommodation and food services not doing quite as well, a bit more sort of in the lower half in terms of job losses. Biggest job loss, though, is nearly 250 fewer construction workers in the city. And that's, again, very much being driven by the fact that there hasn't been as much activity over time. We got to a very high point, but also because the entire region is suffering at the moment in terms of construction levels. And that means that normally, while people would sort of be happy to travel a bit further out, they'd go up to Kapiti, they'd come down to Wellington, they'd go across the Hutt. Across the board, those higher interest rates are meaning that there's just not as much construction activity happening. The same, though, when it comes to like the professional services and admin and support. Although everyone talks a lot about the public service cutbacks, it's not actually the public service itself that's seen sort of the biggest hit. It's all of the other sort of services that support government. Now there's just not that amount of money. The contractor and consulting spend and similar has come back a lot more. And while government's redeploying money from one area into another, and so sort of a bit of a shift internally, the total external money has really created back a whole lot more. This is, again, not an unusual chart to show across the country, although it is certainly harder across the Wellington region. But again, as I go forward, you'll see why that construction hit comes through. The worry, I guess, at the moment is that hit is also very much hugely disproportionately hitting the young people in Porirua. And you can see that in terms of, nearly 400 fewer young people, 15 to 24, in work. That's part of the reason you are seeing more people that are travelling overseas. It's why the number of people unemployed and unengaged across the economy are falling back. You can see that the two groups locally that have still got more workers than before are the older population. Now, I'm not saying that is right, but it's very, very normal in an economic downturn. If you're having to figure out what workers you bring on or what workers you don't keep on, it's very much those who have generally got more skills and experience that you keep because you think that they are more productive and that you can get more from them. True, but often a short-term measure there, because if you don't sort of move with the times, you don't have young people bringing in that good new thinking and innovation, and it makes stuff quite difficult out the other end. Again, no different to anywhere else in the country, but I do think it's worthwhile profiling that it is young people that are absolutely feeling that pressure the most. With all of that, it's not surprising to see that spending has eased slightly in Porirua. Again, worth highlighting that we're not seeing things absolutely crater and crumble. It's just that you've often got more people that are coming through, but at the same time, you don't have quite as much spending. That jobs activity just means that people don't have as much spare cash, down about 0.6% over the 12 months to March 2025. Broadly consistent with some of what we're seeing in other parts of the regional economy as well, particularly in Wellington City. Wellington City having a bit of a harder pullback again, but generally pretty consistent. Not as many people working, not as much spending. Here's where the kickers come through. This is why you've lost 250 odd construction workers, because construction levels have fallen to their lowest during mid-24 at least since before the GFC. Now, that is also off a really high boost up, and that I think is one of the challenges, is that there's a very lumpy amount of work that's come through where businesses have had to up capacity to try and do a huge amount of work, and then when that huge amount of work is not continued sort of until the end of time, that makes things in resourcing very difficult. What is, I guess, important is you'll see that real spike up in the March quarter that's come through, that one little line that's come back up to 200. That's an annual running total. And what's quite impressive is that in the month of March alone, Porirua consented the highest number of residential units that it has with on a monthly basis, with data going back to the 1990s. So I'm not saying it is great guns and that everything is absolutely guns blazing, but certainly in March there was a good little boost, and it does suggest there's a little bit more work coming forward. But in general, pretty hard to convince people to develop as many homes as before, because you know that you're going to make less money when you sell them, costs are higher, and there's not quite as much demand out there, so it's pretty difficult to get that investment over the line. Similar sort of trend when it comes through to the likes of investments locally. Again, coming off a high level, sort of wouldn't be feeling as uncomfortable about this figure, again, coming off that sort of higher peak. It's just that at the moment it means that you've had both residential and non-residential, the more commercial, industrial stuff that's all fallen back pretty heavily at the same time. And so again, not surprising to see that Porirua's general economy is in a tougher spot. You've got a much greater exposure to construction. You've lost the most number of jobs from construction, and that means that the overall tone here is a lot more tricky. That's also all being driven by the fact that house prices have continued to remain at effectively a lower relative rate than where they were before. You can see that there's been a decline in house prices across the board, true, but that gap has opened up a lot more between Porirua and national house prices. Over the last year, house prices here are down about 3.7%, but they're sitting 20% below the peak. And of course, that means that for a lot of people, yes, there's some reasonable buying opportunities in a sense, but if you've got higher levels of unemployment, fewer people in work and similar, it's pretty hard to buy a house if you haven't got a job. It also means, though, that you've got a bunch of people there who might be keen to sell their house and then use some of that money to spend, but they're looking at the price that they might have got in 2021. They don't want to take a lower price. They don't want to take 20% less. And that means that you're increasingly not seeing quite the number of sales coming through. You can see that on the blue line here. Sales numbers in Porirua remaining pretty low at the minute, just under 600 a year on a running total basis. But the number of listings coming through is quite a lot higher. You're definitely getting people that are keen to sell their house, I think from two points of view. The first is that people are increasingly going, look, I'm in a pretty compromised spot. I want to go and try and sell because I really sort of need to make something change. But you've also got a group who are going, and they've been on the market for a while. They're like, well, I want to get that big number that I've seen previously. And people are just not willing to pay that, but they're not taking their houses off the market yet because they're going, surely someone will come along and buy it. Again, trend we're seeing across a lot of urban centres in the country. Auckland's very, very similar, but Wellington region, you're seeing it again across the region, including in Porirua, where those sort of falls have remained a whole lot steeper, and without quite as much economic momentum coming forward from other areas, the fact that construction's down, manufacturing's down, professional services and the public sector, again, just not quite as much of a momentum build coming through. And I think as we move through the year, you'll see those provincial regional sectors get going a bit quicker because there'll be a bit more funding coming through from farmers and the likes. It'll take a bit longer for the likes of some of Porirua's driving factors to start to get that momentum going. Probably more of end of this year sort of vibe now. The last bit as well is just profiling some of the population trends that again will influence all of this. You can see a few things coming through. One, a bit more reliance recently and certainly since about sort of 2017 or so on international migration. So how those international flows go will have a much greater influence on Porirua into the future. That's quite unusual because up until then, Porirua for the last couple of decades hadn't been reliant on international migration. So again, bit of a shift there. At the same time, internal migration has fallen away. Previously, Porirua was able to attract people from other parts of New Zealand here into the city. Now there's more people that are leaving the city who are already living here than are coming in from other parts of the country. So a bit of a trend shift there. Probably the most important one, which looks least important on the chart, is that orange line for the natural increase. It's still high enough. You've still got sort of 400 people more that were born in Porirua in the last year than passed away, but it is declining over time, and we are seeing a real shift there. It's not going to be permanent for Porirua, but it does mean that as things go forward, it's just again a bit more difficult for people to find as many workers and similar, because there'll be more that will be moving out of the workforce than coming in. To sort of lighten the mood a little bit, at the same time, at least this number isn't quite as bad. Yeah, I know, you need a bit of relief, right? At least this figure isn't as bad as what I saw on my recent trip to Korea. Their birth rate has crashed back to one of the lowest in the developed world, to the point where there were more pushchairs that were sold in Korea in 2023 for pets than there were for people. The minute that you start to see, designer dogs and similar and pushchairs around the CBD here is the moment that you know that graph has changed even more fundamentally. Very briefly, before I close things off, and something I don't normally do for the lots of presentations, but given that this is a council, I think it's worthwhile highlighting some of the trends that we're seeing across the local government space. We've been doing a bit more work with Local Government New Zealand to actually raise the profile of this, because there's a lot of talk that happens around what local government is, does and spends on out there in the public, and that often is not quite as borne out in the data as it should be. Looking at what councils actually spend on, this is not specific to Porirua, this is the national figures, but your figures will be pretty similar as well. Is that a good 50% of total council spend goes on the likes of your transport and your water network. Not surprising, but there seems to be a real focus on some of the smaller areas of spending compared to what comes through here. So just noting that there is quite a pretty big focus on what emerges. Also important to reiterate the fact that we know that local councils are responsible for about 25% of infrastructure delivery, despite only getting around about 10% of total government revenues. We do try to highlight this to central government. Sometimes it gets heard, sometimes it doesn't. But what was interesting is that although, again, everyone seems to know this, including myself, no one had been able to put together these sort of figures until we crunched a few numbers at a real comprehensive level. So it's been encouraging to be able to get a bit more factual-based information out there in the conversation. We know that labour costs as well across the economy have been high in recent years, and of course that's put pressure on local council budgets as well, because there's been a greater demand for a lot of people to do stuff, especially when central government were grabbing a lot of talent, and that was again putting more pressure on. You can see on this chart that local government cost pressures for labour costs have been easing alongside national trends, but also coming through at a lower position than central government in recent times. Still elevated to where they would normally be. Previously they were sort of more around 2%, and they're still sort of sitting more around the 3.5% mark, but continuing to ease over time. And I think as you do see more talent out there in the market, of course it's generally not quite as many large wage increases coming through, because people are keen to get a job rather than happy to or don't need to haggle quite as much on wages. But there's a very persistent cost here where people who have had larger pay increases over time, they're locked into the future. No one takes a pay cut in these sort of circumstances. And so generally you're still seeing a bit of pressure maintaining there. But if anyone sort of says that local government inflation, labour costs are sort of increasing at the moment, it's central government that's still driving that more than otherwise. A few other, more, improving points is we've been looking as well at some of the cost inputs to local government because of course, when I showed you some of those inflation figures before, there was quite a lot that was going on there, but that's what households spend on. You guys don't buy the same stuff as what a household does and get a meal kit and a banana and that for lunch. And so instead, we've been looking at some of the services that local councils do buy. And you can see some of them on this chart here. Now, I think that the improving thing is that you're not seeing quite as much intensity in terms of that cost escalation as before. Costs are still going up, so although we're hearing from some councils across the country that there's some sharper tendering that going on, and that's encouraging, in general, there's still a bit of pressure there below the surface, but it's much less intense than the sort of 5-year average. So starting to help, I think, get things a bit more under control. That's coming through a lot more as well in the likes of the engineering space, where there, again, not quite as much work, and so there's a little bit more that everyone has to sharpen their pencil. Likes of water and waste services, there's still a lot of work to do there, and so there's not quite as much sharpening of the pencil because everyone else is asking for so much as well. Similar sorts of trends when it comes to the likes of capital costs. You can see that actually transport costs got ever so slightly cheaper at the end of last year than they were before. That was just because of a bit of a shift in the likes of bitumen prices and aggregates and similar. But again, still pretty high overall. Again, not quite as intense across a number of areas, although land stabilisation, some of that work sort of more around your land and earthworks is still pretty intense in terms of those cost pressures. More interestingly is when you look at cost pressures over time, and that's sort of, yes, okay, it hasn't increased as much in the last wee while. It's increased a lot over time, though. You can see, I guess, the concerns and worries that start to come through, particularly when central government starts to talk about the likes of rates capping at a household inflation rate. This chart looks at if you looked at the household index, the consumer's price index, compared to the capital costs of installing water systems and similar, and you can see just the gulf that opens up over time. In fact, over the last sort of 5-10 years or so, water cost increases have averaged something like 4.3% compared to household costs of just over 2%. So if there were to be rates caps and similar imposed, particularly on infrastructure, kiss goodbye to about half of your expected growth and ability to spend on capex, and that would probably put our water services in an even worse state over time. So a real, I guess, ongoing lesson that we continue to try and profile from an expert advisor point of view, that household inflation is a great metric to try and get your head around inflation generally, and a rubbish metric when you're trying to figure out what you're actually paying for and funding for, because it's just not what actually gets paid out the other end. So the last bit, and probably the doomiest and gloomiest of them all, is that we think that this recovery, although it's coming through, it is just going to be a lot more stunted than we were hoping for. On the export front, that doesn't come through as a hit immediately. People are still they've put in orders that have already still been moved through and similar. It's more that as we head through into next year, we think that export growth sort of grinds to a bit of a halt, just because everyone's sort of a bit shell-shocked, not quite sure of what's coming next, not putting in quite as many orders. Does eventually pick up, but you never sort of see that recovered fully. It's just that, it's not deferred, it's sort of completely destroyed and lost that level of export growth coming forward. That's difficult, particularly if you look at some of the manufacturers around Porirua that are a bit more export focused. That means that, again, that pick up in orders and therefore hiring and similar, a bit more limited overall. For economic growth, it means that, the recovery still comes through, but again, it's sort of halved from where it would otherwise have been. You can see on this chart that we had been expecting back in January growth of more 2.5% starting to move through, starting to rev up that economic engine a whole lot more. Now it's sort of more languishing around the 1-ish% mark. And I guess the view there is that with the recovery coming through, that is encouraging still. Like, we are getting ourselves out of a hole. It's just that we're going from reverse to maybe second gear rather than revving it up into fourth, just because we don't have quite the same amount of fuel in the engine to move us forward. That is a very, very tricky position. I guess the part that I wanted to leave you with, though, before we move to questions, is the fact that despite all the doom and gloom, despite all the challenges and similar that are coming forward, a lot of this is out of people's hands, be it households, be it businesses, be it a local council, or even to a degree the government. I don't know about the rest of you, but so far Donald Trump hasn't picked up my X messages asking him to not tariff stuff. Like, we do not factor into that conversation. We cannot control it, and there's only so much doom scrolling you can do before you start to get pretty downbeat across everything. Important to keep an eye on what's happening. I totally get that, but equally, I think a bit of balance in the middle is still important. Going into the future, it's still about what things you can control. A lot of that is going to be around the likes of costs, because those are still something that threaten at the moment. They are still something that people can have a bit more control over, and as well as that sort of engagement that you're having from a council point of view with the community. Not saying that everyone's going to be stoked with some of the messaging that's going to be coming out, because it's still clearly a tough time, but sort of making sure that everyone's aware of some of those different drivers, because certainly what's happening locally is not exactly what's happening in the rest of the national economy, and some of the challenges that you're presented with are things that you've got to react to rather than that you've chosen to decide to deal with, in a sense. With the doom and gloom, I'll turn the economic fire hose off like normal, and through the chair, happy to take as many questions as you want, and however much time I've got allowed.
Thank you very much, Brad. We can give you plenty of time. We've got Josh, Ross, Kathleen, Jeff. Start with.
All right. Thank you very much. Really great presentation, as always, Brad. A couple questions. First, just in relation to the new normal regarding the OCR that you've talked about. In your view, is that just the reality of a post-COVID world and the current international economic climate, or can that also be partially explained by the government's repeal of the dual mandate and focus on employment levels?
Almost none of the second one. Like, honestly, there's very, very little in the last couple of years, or even now, that I think the Reserve Bank having a dual mandate would make a difference to how they set the official cash rate. Like, I get that everyone likes to argue it, particularly politically. You see central government both here and in the States and similar talk a lot about it. From a Reserve Bank point of view, like, you have to care about how the unemployment rate goes, because if employment or unemployment, depending on which side of the coin you want to talk about, if that's not going great, then eventually, generally, you get less inflationary pressure come through, because people aren't spending, and therefore there's not as much sort of overall demand that can stoke prices up. I guess that's why as well we're a little bit cautious at the moment, where normally lower employment levels like we're seeing at the moment, lower GDP and similar, should be meaning that people aren't willing to put on price increases. But there are a lot of areas that are still able to put on price increases because their own input costs are coming through. And I feel like because of that, the risk here is more that it's a supply side issue of how much stuff can we create with the resources we've got available, rather than are there people to buy it. We haven't had a supply shock in quite a while. COVID was one. The last one before that really was the oil shocks in the 70s. So I think the new normal is a lot more around sort of where the geopolitical arena is, and in particular as well, looking at those supply chains. Like, we sort of ignored them at our peril in the decade or so leading up to COVID, quite rightly. things just worked. You just bought stuff and it appeared. And then if you're a business, you bought more stuff to replenish your stocks because it just appeared as well. There was no issue until there was. And I think we're sort of seeing that now where people are a lot more sort of uncertain about the trading environment. So they're either thinking of holding a bit more stock if they can pay for it or just willing to go without. And that means that, again, you start to see that pressure build up in the system. I mentioned the likes of butter prices before. Part of the reason that butter prices are higher is because your other sort of, fats option that you had, the likes of olive oil, got a whole lot more expensive. So you transferred from olive oil to butter. The issue with the olive oil and the reason that sort of went down is because all of a sudden climate change and similar meant that we weren't growing quite as many olives in the right places. So those are issues we haven't grappled with for a while. My sort of long expectation is that to see interest rates go a whole lot lower than where they are at the moment, or even almost in a sense any lower, would require the economy not only to get into a worse state, but probably most importantly for expectations to be that prices would fall, because everyone is so kneecapped that they'd have to cut prices to just stimulate a bit more spending. At the moment, I don't talk to any businesses that are doing that outside of construction, and half of them are falling over within a couple of weeks of making that call. So I think we are closer to the new normal. Most expectations are that the neutral interest rate is around where we are at the moment. So it's the Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold. You're not stopping any economic activity happening, but you're certainly not trying to jazz up anything either.
Brilliant, thank you. I've just had a couple others. In terms of your economic forecasts, are you able to speak at all to the projected impact of the cancelled pay equity settlements from the budget that's just come out? And in particular, those things, I think we've been told it's about $12.8 billion of an impact there, mostly going to low-income earners. Is that something that you're able to project, or is part of your forecasts?
We haven't forecast, only because the forecast that I've shown you, we put together in April, and so sort of before the budget. To be fair, even Treasury haven't sort of fully modelled out what the pay equity stuff is going to do on some of the spending levels and what have you. Overall, the implication there would be that there won't be quite as much wage growth as there might have before, not as much disposable income, and so not as much spending by households. So yes, it will have an impact there. I guess the point I would also make, though, is that I feel like politically, no matter who was in power, this was an issue that was going to have to be grappled with, because the 12.8, but let's call it 13 just for ease of numbers, was a fairly large, I think it was like 2/3 proportion of the entire operating spend over the next couple of years. That would have meant that no matter who was in power, at some point someone would have had to choose between effectively pay equity, the likes of health and education, inflation, investment, and other policies and so on. Like, it does seem like, from an economic point of view, that the pay equity changes that were made in 2020 did expand the scope of things to a large enough degree that it had a fundamental shift on the fiscals. I won't make political comment on whether it was the right move or otherwise. That's for politicians to make their choices and defend them. But I do think that fiscally it was going to become a constraint no matter what.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And just my last question was around when you talked about the general outlook, tougher for sure. I think that was the wording that you used. From a council perspective, often we can feel limited in terms of the levers we have to pull around local economic growth. And so I've got a sort of a broader and a more specific part of that question around, so the broader part being, are there particular courses of action that you recommend that councils can be taking in tougher economic times, particularly in relation to their local economic growth? And then specifically within that, if we're looking at the constant tension between, do we focus more on investment and spending core infrastructure? Do we focus on tightening our belts, trying to reduce rates a little bit more? Are you able to speak to whether you consider there to be like a broad rule of thumb around what impacts that can have on the local economy, or is it just a case of the devil's in the detail, it depends?
I mean, economists love the phrase, it depends. There's never a sort of nice, simple, straight down the middle answer. I think, though, a few points. Having a bit of stability in an increasingly uncertain world is something that council can provide a bit more of, particularly on the capital spend side. I mean, let's be real. We had this conversation, I say I probably did have it with this council. I had it with a lot of others during COVID when, again, things were very uncertain and there was a real view of, do we cut back on stuff? And my view at the time, and it remains so now, is that one, for some of your infrastructure, you need to get on with it anyway. And two, it's sort of important that particularly you look at the level of construction employment in the city here. Like that is a pretty, you've got 15-16% of total employment here related to that. If you can maintain that level of investment, which is important anyway, that's going to likely provide at least a little bit more of a solid base than otherwise, because also that will unlock more ability to develop when things start to turn around. And they will. It will take a while, but they will. You want to be ready for that expansion as well, rather than going, oops, we sort of wasted the opportunity and now everything's ready to go and we're sort of the constraint. So I think that's important. Equally important to, yes, sort of control costs and similar over time. Like I don't think anyone around here is thinking now is the best time to, just absolutely throw off the shackles. But equally, now is not the time to sort of, really shrink in either. There is a balance between those areas. I guess it is mostly about bang for buck. In terms of those returns, and particularly I think for local government and central government, there is also a need, and you saw this coming through with the central government with Budget 25, of doing the stuff that local councils can do best and no one else can sort of do, and leaving the rest to do their own devices. Like at the moment, in my mind, the private sector, it would probably be a challenging conversation around the likes of subsidies or supports for certain industries when, one, it's not clear if those industries can maintain their current momentum even in normal times, and two, when again the pressures on your budget line will be such that you've sort of got to look at the stuff that you can deliver best in your area, and I think it would be pretty hard pressed to sort of provide a lot of support out on those other sides. It's a tough message to deliver, but I guess the last bit comes through, and it's always a view, and I think this is definitely a challenge for the community. What local government spends and invests on is equally directly related to what the community wants. Now, the difficult thing is that the community wants a lot but doesn't necessarily want to pay for some of the increases. I get that. Prices are high. But I do think part of that is also that there is a challenge and a disconnect, if you will. I'm not saying it's good, bad, or otherwise, but it does persist between the likes of what's collected for rates and what gets delivered out the other side, sort of thing. Like people don't connect them quite as well in their heads. It's why if you say to people, even from a general tax point of view, right, you say, do you want to give the government $10 more a week? No. Do you want to pay nurses $5 more and teachers $5 more a week? Yes. The connect for those is often disconnected, and so I think that's an area where over time things can improve a touch, but also why there is a level of going, when the community is asking for lower rates or similar, having a really definitive view, not just to save more money, because I get that, I mean, like everyone should do that, true, but like a very definitive, what are you willing to cut? And are you willing to go and turn up to whoever community is that's getting cut from and say, I don't think you're worth it? Because that's effectively what you're doing. I think the tough conversation will need to continually be had. But that's also why I put up that chart over what local councils spend on, because I often think that we spend a lot of time on a very small amount of spending when realistically, if you wanted to make some big changes, you'd have to make them to the capital program, and that would be pretty debilitating. Final point is that there is still more scope in my mind for what central government could do on that end. I'm sure that no one around the tables here will disagree necessarily, but you look at some of those areas that central government does spend on, and the fact that, at the moment we're getting close to spending $1 in every 5 government dollars on the likes of New Zealand Super on a universal basis does mean that the sort of, you can make as much tinkering at the edges as you want, but sort of doing the fundamental stuff, that's going to be a much more difficult political football.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, just further to that, and coming off it, one of the things that we are looking at and discussing in this environment, because people are asking for exactly what you're saying, reduce how much that you're, reduce the rates, but also spend more and do more investment. We're pushing out our balanced budget, and I wonder if you've got any commentary around that, particularly in this sort of economic environment, or do you see that as being something that is mostly just a political decision that you wouldn't comment on?
I wouldn't want to get too into it, only because I haven't seen the details in too much regard. I guess that the only comment I would make, that I make to every council and, again, central government around the country, is that understanding around the difference between good debt and bad debt. Living within your means is absolutely critical unless you're investing for a larger long-term investment, because that's not day-to-day spend, and that's where you can spread the cost over time. Doesn't mean you can just sort of put everything on capital. There's still a carrying cost and sort of in that, but, buying a house with a mortgage, very much accepted standard practice, good move, long-term asset. Putting the groceries on Afterpay when you've eaten them quicker than you're able to pay them off doesn't work very well long-term.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's good. Sorry, along similar lines, so rate levels, overall rate levels have been increasing significantly everywhere. And trying to talk specifically about Porirua here, what sort of contribution or impact do you think that's having on construction levels in the area and sales as well, in terms of overall rate levels in particular areas?
There's a lot of talk about it, but I think that's also just because it's a lot more sort of obvious and in your face than a lot of the other things. Like I've always thought one of the challenges, particularly around rates, is that it's a demand. You know, so I will come up to you and demand money from you rather than just siphoning it out of your wallet before it even gets there, sort of thing, like with a lot of other charges. So there is a little bit of that going on. I think that it becomes a bit tough, I think, to say that rates are going to be a key constraint on the housing market generally, because you pay rates no matter what on that house. Like, I pay rates via my landlord because I'm paying them to pay for the house, sort of thing. So at some point, someone pays the rates no matter what. So I don't think it should have a huge limit there. I think it's more there is a psychological barrier where people go, geez, it's already hard enough to come up with the money for a house. Then you look at the ongoing costs of it, and in some parts of the country at the moment, certainly in Wellington City, it's generally still better to rent than it is to own on a short-term cash flow basis, because you can get cheaper rents than before because there's higher supply and less demand. So that does have a bit of an influence. I certainly think there is a concern across the country around the likes of development costs for further construction. I totally get that. There is a very difficult conversation though over user pays versus sort of general spread, and I don't envy those sitting around the table and the decisions they make there, because it does come forward. I think what increasingly emerges is that there is not so much an issue with the user pays or anything else like that. It's more the cash flow bit, especially from a development point of view, that people go, geez, it's just really hard to stomach this up front, and so you need to spread it over time. It's just that no one likes to be told they've got to spend whatever it is for the next 30 years or whatever to get their house. So that does come back, I think, more to the general view that for a long time we paid more and we got more, and now you pay more and you get less, or maybe get the same if you're lucky. So there is a bit of a shift that inflation has brought to it. Long story short, yes, there are some elements, I think, in terms of rates, development contributions and similar, that have an influence. I think at the moment, though, if I'm thinking about development or anything else, I'm at a commercial level going, will this investment stack up and will I have the work to be done? Probably not at the moment, and I'm just not sure about the future, so I'm not willing to commit. On a residential side, I'm going, look, house prices are lower than they were before. Interest rates are coming down, but still relatively high compared to where I might have first thought. It's just, I think it's going to take a few years for everyone to recalibrate what it should be, because at the moment everything is worse than what it should be in people's minds. That will shift, but it will take a bit of time.
Can I also ask, you'll know that local government are going to have to come up, or government is forcing us at the end of June to stump up with comparative data on each of our entities. Do you have any comments to make about what the outcome of that will be?
Yes. Two very brief comments then. One is, obviously everyone will use them as league tables and similar. I get that, and that's sort of inevitable. I think that will require a little bit of conversation and explanation that may or may not be taken up well publicly, because councils do a lot of quite different things. I would say, though, and probably to the frustration of some in the room, that I don't necessarily think that some of the benchmarking is an awful idea, only because as someone who goes through all 78 local council and regional council LTPs, APs and ARs every year, having to go through a PDF and bring out 2 years of data every time means that I haven't got an idea what you guys did 5 years ago unless I pull like 4 PDFs together. So I do think that there is a reasonableness in bringing some of that information together. How it's used, just like with the decile system with schools, was there for a funding purpose, gets used of is it a good school or not basis. League tables are challenging, but I guess as well, that's the communication of do you let that level of communication just wash over you, or do you put your best foot forward and try and explain some of those differences? It's coming anyway, so best foot forward is, I think, the most important point.
Oh, yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think it's not a bad idea in the long term.
Kathleen?
I've got a few questions. I'll start with the ones that are just clarifying ones.
Yes,
because
please.
it's faster. The graph on the trades, the types of jobs
Yes.
in Porirua, can you just clarify, is that people who reside here or jobs here?
Depends on exactly which chart you're talking about. The one that showed the 250 odd jobs fewer in construction, that's based on where the people work. Based on where the people live.
Yeah.
The chart towards the start of how many, the 16% or so of people that work in Porirua, that was by workplace address. Yeah. So where the job is rather than where the people live.
Okay, so all those jobs were just in the city, but not the people who actually live in the city are doing those jobs.
Correct, and there is a bit more of a flow there. I mean, to be fair, when we have looked at the numbers, they generally cancel each other out. So for the construction one, for example, it might well be that you have a whole lot of construction firms that, their head office, their yard and that is in Porirua, but there might be a few people from Kapiti or a few people from Wellington that come through. But there's also 250 fewer people who work in construction somewhere, probably here, but also might be in the neighbouring districts or cities they live in Porirua, but they're now not employed. Taken together, they'll broadly cancel each other out in that regard.
Just quickly, on that one though, was there a chart in there that showed the jobs that people who live here do?
Yes, not at a total proportion level. I can supply that though. I'll come through jacking that afterwards with that.
The other one, okay, the March consents.
Yes.
Gosh, the March consents that have gone up. Do you know where those, were they new builds? Were they people just renovating? Or?
Yes, no, new builds. Full. That's a new house. That's excluding alterations and additions. So yeah, okay, cool. But it's, 72 off the top of my head was the March month figure. Like I say, largest monthly total ever.
72 in Porirua.
Yep.
Okay, cool. The population leaving Porirua.
Do you want to know where they're going? Oh no.
Oh yeah. I just wanted a bit of comment about that.
Partly.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was that? I missed that.
I just wanted a bit of commentary around that because we did see people speaking about that in our, submissions and.
It's that. It's also that, I mean, there has been a general shift. Again, that's sort of not it's not an exclusive to you guys, Porirua issue. It's across the board more for urban centres. You're seeing that people are generally moving out to, cheaper options, but also sort of with a bit more lifestyle, don't have to worry as much about traffic. So we have been seeing more people that have been sort of moving generally, I guess in Wellington it's been sort of a spread out, from Wellington City out into Lower Hutt and Porirua, and then Porirua and the Hutt moving out to the likes of Wairarapa or Kapiti Otaki and similar over time. There is, I guess, part of it where you will see some people that will be heading overseas. That is, we've got a record outflow of Kiwis at the moment, but some of it is also people leaving for price and lifestyle opportunities at the moment.
Okay. Oh, thanks for clarifying that. Your point about older people, the older age bracket,
Yes. I always get in trouble for this.
Returning to work, they were on the positive side. Do you have any sort of info or commentary around that? Is that because it's more expensive now and they need more money to they've had to go back to work? Or
I think there's probably three elements. One is there's part of that, like everyone's struggling with costs and similar at the moment. Two is around the skills element of, they've got skills and so are a little bit more attractive on that front. Three, we are seeing, we don't have this data at a local level, but I think it's part of the wider mix that you are seeing a greater level of part-time work and similar coming forward where businesses aren't able to commit to sort of a full-time, 40 hours a week person, but they're able to do something a little bit more limited, which again is often an option that someone in their older age group is keen to do a bit of work, but sort of not too much overall because they're sort of retiring or semi-retired and similar. And so that plus the skills bit means that older people often seem a little bit more attractive on that front.
Okay, cool, thanks. The new budget, and I just wondered if you had any comments around the new budget.
Oh, so many comments, but I will constrain myself as much as possible for time and otherwise. We did do a webinar on this earlier this week, which I think we're putting out a link at some point, so hopefully that might assist as well. I mean, we've in our view, the budget was what we've termed a switch-it budget. You're seeing a switch around from spending in one area to another. It's quite unusual for government. Normally, the idea is that you lock in last year's budget and you bolt on a few more things, but the last couple of years, the government has been working to find more and more savings across the board to pay for new other items that have come through. some of the changes that government have made, I think, will have some important contributions to the economy. They take a bit of time to wind up, but the likes of investment boost, I think that will fundamentally support a bit more investment coming forward. Difficult at the moment because everyone's still pretty uncertain, but I think it makes some marginal decisions a little bit easier to get over the line. And when you do start to see a bit more economic recovery and people start to invest, I think that will jazz things up a bit more. The wider point, I guess, is that there seems to be an underlying shift in the way that the government is approaching things, where there is still a willingness for government to provide the social safety net, don't get me wrong, but there is also a real view that government will not be the first part of the safety net. It is the last sort of part. And so instead of providing a lot of that support up front, it's wanting to provide it sort of if required, sort of rather than first port of call. You see that with some of the means testing around the likes of Best Start, and similarly you see it with some of the KiwiSaver changes. You see it even with the likes of the changes that they've made around job seeker benefits for 18 to 19-year-olds. Government will still provide support, but they just won't do it right at the start. If someone else can pay, government's quite keen, I think, for them to pay. That's a change in how it's operated before. The last bit is there's a lot of infrastructure investment that's been announced by government, and obviously that'll influence and impact what councils get for recovery rates and similar. There is a gap at the moment between some of the bigger infrastructure commitments that government has made and the actual delivery out into the economy. And it's a real challenge that I think we're hearing a lot in the construction sector, where people say, look, government is announcing all this stuff all the time, but we don't necessarily see the work coming through to us. And so I think there's still a bit of a gap between that sort of announcement and delivery. Give it another year or so and I think things get better, but for the short term, and of course important locally, given the focus on the construction sector, that does mean that momentum might take a bit more time to rev up.
Can I just talk to you a little bit about that construction? Because I've heard you say a lot so far around it. And so it's our biggest trade in Porirua.
16% of employment. It's like, I think the difference is not only is it your biggest, but it's bigger than what it would be than the average sort of for the national economy, which means that you are overexposed, if you will, to how construction works locally.
1/6.
1/6.
Yeah. It's also the biggest job loss.
Yep.
250 jobs.
That's also because it is the biggest, though. Like, it's the biggest, so it's got further to fall. But yes, yep.
In that graph, yeah, cool. And I also heard you say prices are there putting prices down? Or?
Some of them are. So, I mean, some of the comments that we get back when we talk to construction firms, this is broadly at a national basis, and we sort of don't sort of try and collect it or look at it too much on a regional level. But you're seeing that some prices are coming back to a degree. Some of that is because, timber prices have been cheaper in a few parts. Sometimes because your other input costs have come back. Sometimes it's because builders are going, I'm so desperate for work that I'll price under my break even because I just want to have a job on the go so that I can keep things moving. That last one, where you're pricing below what the cost of delivering the job is, means that it's not even that you're making less profit, you're making a loss outright. You can only do that for so long before you go under, which is why you're seeing more and more construction businesses that are being liquidated and similar, because they just, money in, money out doesn't match up. I don't know how widespread that would be locally relative to the rest of the country, but it's a very quick way to go insolvent, is to cost below or price below your costs. But it does show that people are desperate to try and get work. They're desperate to find anything to just sort of get that next set of jobs on the books.
Thanks, Brad.
Jeff.
Kia ora, Brad.
Kia ora.
Actually, you have been relieved of several of my parts. I see as my colleagues have already asked many of them. I'm going to do the international ones, and we can both accept the fact that we are not apologists for the United States government, and we'll start there. Should we, as much as... actually, I'll go back to the first question. I noted the graph with regards to the divergence between GDP and inflation. By your understanding, it's been quite some time since that's been that wide. Is it time to call it stagflation too?
I've heard a lot more people talking about stagflation and asking me that question recently. We're getting closer. I don't know if I'll be willing to put the stake in the ground yet. For those not aware, stagflation is the idea that you've got higher and higher prices coming through even when economic activity is weak, and that's because, again, that sort of supply pressure keeps coming through. There are pockets of more of it. I think that's certainly fair to say at the moment. I think the difference is that, some of the stagflation that we had, like the classic stuff in the 70s, and that was like quite large volumes of it. You had really weak activity and you had really high inflation. We haven't got really high inflation. We've just got persistently, uncomfortably, slightly higher than normal inflation. But after a build-up of the last couple of years, that hurts enough, right? And so I think there are elements of that coming forward. What's tough and challenging is that if you look at some of the areas of the economy, I guess the question here comes back to, right, why are prices increasing when the economy's not doing well? Like, who's raising? The question that comes through is who's raising the prices? And in some areas, it's because we've probably didn't raise them enough over time. So you could argue that we're having slightly higher inflation now because we had slightly artificially too low for a period. When it comes to the likes of commodity prices, the likes of your butter and similar, like that's a more volatile group, but it's sort of a bit harder to look at that. Bit of a double-edged sword as well, because you get weaker, you're getting stronger prices, which are hitting households. You're also getting more money into the farming sector. So like, push me, pull you in some areas. You look at one of the other big drivers at the moment, that's around energy costs, and that's because we need to invest more and more money into the likes of transmission, generation, distribution of electricity across the country. Similar as rates. Rates are a key contributor to higher inflation at the moment, and part of that is because you guys have got some pretty serious work programs that you've got to get on with and spend on, like on infrastructure, but like that adds cost into the system, and that's also a cost that you're having to pay because you've been given it by your suppliers over time. So
Insurance as well.
insurance is another one, and again, insurance, you look at that and it's like, well, it's because we've had more and more big catastrophic events that keep costing, so to get reinsurance is more expensive because we're riskier. All of those are explainable, but it also gets to the point where just because you can explain it doesn't negate the fact that it's there and it's sort of hitting. So getting closer towards stagflation potentially, but different from what it was in the 70s. Like, we just are in a different position economically.
Yeah. Next question is, noting the position, the highly variable position of the United States government, should we not also be concerned about the role of China and their economic positioning, considering that we export twice as much stuff overall to China than we do to the United States? And I am concerned about the demographic shifts there and the ability for the economy in China as well, which is not as robust as it was 10 years ago.
Definitely. I mean, China's had 3 years of population decline now, first time since the 60s. We knew it was going to happen. We probably didn't think it would happen quite as quick, but, the demographic shifts are really starting to emerge there. Yes, we should be worried. I guess the challenge that comes through is like, what do you do about that, both for China but also for the US? I mean, you go down the road and find me an exporter and say, no, stop trading with these countries immediately. It just won't happen because there's enough there at the moment. I think it's that you do have to sort of increase that diversity of trade portfolio over time. And to be fair, we're getting there. We are actually reducing our reliance. We have seen a reduction in reliance on China over time. It's just that in the last couple of years, we've replaced that with more reliance on the US. So it's a bit of there's been a little bit of other stuff that's come through, though. We've got, of course, trade agreements with the EU and the UK in recent years. We've got, agreements close to being signed and finished up with the likes of the United Arab Emirates and the Gulf Cooperation Council. So all of that is encouraging because there's obviously more money there. To give you an idea of sort of how much that's starting to work, we haven't even got those trade agreements in the Middle East yet. And this season we saw double the volume of cherry exports from New Zealand to the Middle East than we did a year ago. So it's gone from tiny to double as tiny, still small, but it's showing a bit of a shift. And I think we'll continue to do that over time. We've got more opportunities coming through in the likes of India. Put it this way, New Zealand hasn't got a trade agreement yet with them, and even then we're starting to see growing trade with India just because we're a bit more on the radar. Government did in Budget 25 allocate, I think it was something, a couple tens of millions of some description to trying to bolster our trade with Asia, not just China, but the likes of ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia. Again, good time to do it. This year is 50 years of relations with ASEAN, so we know them, we trade with them, we've got a good history, and I think we can do more. But it requires people and boots on the ground, and so I think that's sort of the most important thing for New Zealand going forward, is that you don't work very well internationally unless you sort of get there and make the connections. And while we've been doing that, you've got to continue to do that sort of year in, year out.
You noted that there was an uptick in our primary production exports. Just noting your previous answer, where are those destinations going in terms of this period of reporting?
At the moment, meat's going very heavily into the US because even though they've got tariffs, they really quite like our beef. And honestly, I think we supply something like 10% of the beef going into Macca's hamburgers in the States. Which is maybe a negotiating point with the US potentially, but it's going to those sort of areas. We're also seeing, I think, over time that we're continuing to get more and more value out of the exports that we're sending. You look at the likes of our fruit exports overseas, they're going into most of the key markets. There's sort of growth across the board. You look at that in the likes of Europe, you look at it in the likes of China and similar. There's still a healthy level of I want to eat the good stuff, and so New Zealand can supply that. I think the challenge is that it means that, yes, it's increasingly important that we provide or find new export markets in terms of countries, but often those are pretty small shifts over time. Like, you don't, apart from China in the last decade, there haven't been many times that New Zealand sort of found someone new. Well, we know that there are countries out there. It's not like there's an undiscovered one out there. Takes a while to sort of get that over the line. It's more, I think, on the product side that we've got a lot of innovation that we can do because we have seen that over time. Back in 2019, when I first went to China, still quite traditional levels of, or trends around eating and food consumption similar. Went back in 2023, they were all eating pizza, and New Zealand was supplying half of the mozzarella into that market at a pretty high value. It's stuff like that. I'm not saying it's the only one, but you're sort of seeing more of that over time when I think we can do more. Again, though, to the point before, that requires us getting into market because how people consume stuff is increasingly different over time. We know that consumers have these changing tastes and preferences, and also what we think about in terms of a product and what local markets think are quite different. I made quite a fool of myself when I was in China that first time when I asked the head of Pix Peanut Butter if he knew why Chinese consumers had quite so much peanut butter and why their toast consumption. I didn't realise that was a Chinese breakfast sort of thing, and Pix looked at me and sort of went, no, they don't eat toast for breakfast, they put it in their cooking. I don't use peanut butter that way. I had no idea, but that sort of showed the naivety. So it's just a bit of a shift in how you sort of put those products to market, what people get out of them, and how we market them through. Last point on that is that given the pet focus that I talked about in Korea, you're seeing that across the world. I do think New Zealand's got a real opportunity for some of the offcuts in some of our meat industries and similar to do better on the sort of pet stock front, because that seems to be a growing market globally.
Right. Last question. It would appear to me that the concerns I have with regards to the United States economy is really in terms of the products that we will get from the United States. They seem to be highly attenuated to the tariff issues. Steel and aluminium, particularly from China, will have an impact on the types of goods that are coming into New Zealand. So looking at gas turbines, aircraft and spacecraft parts, motor vehicles, machinery and mechanical appliances, that's getting close to more than half of what we're getting from the United States. How insulated can we be from this if we have to rely on the United States for some of the industries, including the electricity sector, to provide that kind of hardware here in New Zealand?
It'll cost us more, is the short answer there. And you look at that, I mean, I was talking to some people in the automotive industry yesterday. They get some of their parts that they are sort of almost semi-manufactured in Japan, sent through to the US to be finished up and then sent to us. And at the moment, there's no way to cut out the middleman because there's just not the production facilities elsewhere. That will, I think, happen over time. Because despite the US wanting to bring manufacturing back there, at the moment, again, people are just not going to trust that they can continue to trade in the US and have a stable environment. They also, though, won't look to China because they know that China and the US continue to have the sort of, implied biffo that goes on. And so instead, they're going to say, well, look, let's sort of find other alternatives through the likes of Southeast Asia. But that takes time and money to invest in. And so I don't think you sort of see a shift quickly. That goes back to my wider point that I do worry a little bit about the supply chain effects that come through from these sort of deteriorations where stuff's still available, it just costs you more, or it's less available immediately, takes a bit more time, all of that slows the entire process down. So I don't think you'll see a shift immediately because I don't think there's that many. The supply chains we've got in the world have gotten pretty good at doing their thing really, really well. If you want to create a bit more redundancy, that will totally happen in the global economy, and that will cost more because it means you'll have to have 3 different plants on standby depending on who's being tariffed on that day of the week. It probably will happen. I think you'll see a shift from the just-in-time to the just-in-case supply chain model, but that will genuinely start to cost us more in all ways, shapes and forms, and that's possibly where you get higher levels of trend inflation going forward.
Thank you. Oh, no, Mike's got one.
Yeah,
Sorry.
just one quick question. I'm almost at retirement age now, and
You're lying.
when we talk about the OCR going down like we do, 2.5, everybody trumpets it as a marvellous thing, and it's great, all my kids' mortgages come down, but my investment stops paying me money. And what sort of an impact does that have on the spend in the city?
Means that my grandmother calls me a lot more often to ask what the investment advice I have for her is, which is always fun. No, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think, it depends a little bit on what eventually happens to Both general savings rates, but also New Zealand super, because although investment returns are not quite as good at the moment, and of course there's that question, right, for people, and I was speaking at a retirement home in Canterbury yesterday, and they asked a similar sort of question, like, where do I put my money? And I was like, well, generally, I think most people are going to put them into term deposit rates and similar. Yes, they're lower, but they're at least stable. Put them into the stock market at the moment. This week, you could have either made 3% or lost 3% or both in the space of a couple of days. So that volatility makes it hard if you're wanting to make sort of bigger spending or investment decisions over time. It will just be that you'll take a lower return. And to be fair, like, that's how interest rates work. The idea with interest rates not only is that if you drop them, then people will be able to spend more because their mortgage repayments aren't quite as much, but it means that it's worth less to keep your money saved and better to spend it on a relative basis. People will still need to save for a period, but it means that you will have to effectively either eat lower returns or be willing to take a bigger risk. And I guess the question there is that with that level of uncertainty, and this is why it's interesting to see more people fixing for slightly longer at the moment, people are starting to be a bit keener to meet uncertainty with any stability they can, even if it's not going to be their necessarily best play, definitely. The question of hindsight is sort of a little bit left aside because people are going, I'd rather know exactly what I've got now than sort of risk it for a biscuit.
So you're telling my wife I can buy the camper van?
I hold no personal responsibility for individual members and councillors' spending decisions, no.
Thank you, Brad. That was awesome as always, and we will see you at BizFest. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Okay, councillors, we're just going to go offline.